Mr. Johnson, could you come in? I heard the CEO's voice as I clicked the door open and entered his office. There he was, sitting at the back with a woman by his side. It was his wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson. Seeing both of them looking at me, I got nervous and froze. Then Mrs. Anderson said kindly, "I'm sorry for calling you in so suddenly. I hope we didn't interrupt your work." I quickly responded, "No, no, it's all fine." I had only spoken to the CEO, Mr. Anderson, when I first greeted him upon joining the company. As for Mrs. Anderson, I had seen her around but never spoken to her before. I wondered what both of them wanted to talk about with me. I was a bit nervous, thinking it might be something bad, but then quickly reassured myself with my usual cheerfulness, saying, "It's okay, it's okay." Anyway, Mrs. Anderson continued, while Mr. Anderson remained silent, which made it even more intimidating. "Mr. Johnson, what is your father's name?" Mrs. Anderson asked. My father's name? I was surprised. It's quite rare to be asked about your father's name at work, especially being called to the CEO's office for it. Is there something with my father? I blurted out, somewhat panicked. Then Mr. Anderson, who had been silent, started laughing. "Mary, you're not asking it right. Look how surprised Mr. Johnson is." Embarrassed, Mrs. Anderson looked down a bit and said, "I'm sorry. No, it's not like that. Your first name is Mike, right?" "Yes, my first name is Mike and my father's name is George," I answered her question. Then Mrs. Anderson exclaimed, "Oh, I knew it." And then a shocking truth was about to be revealed. My name is Mike Johnson, a 29-year-old who loves living freely. To be precise, I loved freedom in the past, but now my thoughts have completely changed. The turning point for me was, without a doubt, marriage. Before getting married, I hated being tied down. After graduating from high school, I didn't go to college. Instead, I saved up money through part-time jobs and went abroad. Traveling as a backpacker through various countries was truly enjoyable and meaningful. It helped me break free from the social mindset that I felt constrained by. However, I had a fateful encounter in one country. It happened when I was touring Thailand alone. After eating at a street stall one afternoon, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my stomach and had to sit down on the side of the road. Thinking it would subside after a short rest, I underestimated the pain, which only grew worse. "I need to see a doctor before nightfall. This is serious," I thought, sweating from the pain. I considered calling for medical help, but I didn't even have the energy to look up a hospital. Just as my vision started to blur, a woman asked in English, "Are you okay?" Lifting my face with the last of my strength, I saw a young woman who appeared to be American looking at me with concern, and an older man standing next to her. "I have a terrible stomach ache. It started suddenly after eating," I managed to say despite the pain. The older man then said, "It might be food poisoning. It's dangerous to leave it untreated. Let's go to the hospital right now." I was in too much pain to respond, and before I knew it, I was being carried to a car by the young woman and the older man and taken to the hospital. After receiving proper treatment at the hospital, my stomach pain subsided and I was out of danger. Since I'd had to stay overnight, the two who helped me went home, but the young woman came back the next morning to check on me. As I was getting discharged, I expressed my gratitude, saying it was thanks to them I was doing well, and asked for her contact details to thank her later. "Oh, then let me give you my father's business card." Handing me the card, I saw George Wilson, CEO of Wilson Real Estate Co. Ltd. written on it. "Wow, he's a CEO," I exclaimed. As a young man with only part-time job experience, seeing the word CEO made me feel like I was looking up to the heavens. Yes, my father had business in Thailand for a few days, and I came along for sightseeing, she explained. Her name was Sophia Wilson. The two who had helped me were father and daughter. Sophia was a college student a year younger than me. She said she wanted to travel to various countries while she was still a student. Having a similar desire to see the world while I was young, Sophia and I had a great conversation. I learned that Sophia and her father, Mr. Wilson, would be returning to their country in a few days. Although I had planned to continue backpacking, the severe stomach pain had given me a glimpse of the afterlife, so I decided to return to the States soon. After being discharged, knowing Mr. Wilson was interested in fine liquors from Sophia, I consulted my father, who was knowledgeable about alcohol, and ordered some specialty liquor as a thank you for their help in Thailand. I sent Mr. Wilson the liquor and Sophia a gift card by courier. Soon, Sophia contacted me to say thank you and suggested we go shopping together as she didn't know what to buy with the gift card. So we went on a shopping date. Shopping together, Sophia said buying something together makes it more memorable than doing it alone. I was happy and enjoyed the time with her. As Sophia and I saw more of each other, we grew closer and eventually, she became my girlfriend. Not only did Mr. Wilson appreciate the liquor gift, but he also took a liking to me, and with parental approval, Sophia and I began dating and later got married. Now, even though I still believe in a free and unbound lifestyle, I've come to realize that finding stability for a life with the one you love is also a form of happiness. That's why I decided to work for a general company. There, I faced the harsh realities of society. I wanted to work for a well-known company with a good salary for Sophia's sake, but that was a high bar for someone like me with only a high school diploma. Sophia's father, Mr. Wilson, offered me a job at Wilson Real Estate, hoping I would eventually help PR the company. Sophia said, "Why work at a general company? You can always work at my dad's company." But I felt it wasn't right to rely on my father-in-law's connection, having only high school and part-time job experience. Besides, I've always been a man of spirit and energy. I was sure I could get hired by a good company in unfounded confidence. In hindsight, now I realize it was youthful arrogance, a lack of maturity. I went to about 10 interviews and was rejected by 9. That summer, at 22, I learned that enthusiasm alone doesn't get you a job. Should I go to college now? Studying for college entrance exams now, I likely wouldn't make it into a prestigious university. Maybe I'm a loser. Just when that thought crossed my mind, my phone rang. This is the recruitment department of EMR Corporation. We decided to hire you, Mr. Johnson. Can you start next week? The woman on the phone said. Really? I'd exclaimed in a higher pitch than usual. After getting the details about my first day and hanging up, I shouted yes, and fist pumped. It was a sunny day, and I was at home with Sophia. You got it. That's great, congratulations, she said, very happy for me. Though she might have preferred me working at Wilson Real Estate, her support for what I wanted to do made me happy. Thank you, Sophia. In the next week, my life as an office worker began. On my first day, I wore an unfamiliar suit and tie carrying a business bag. As one of the many office workers and students heading to the city center on a packed train, I managed to make it to the nearest station. After getting off the train and straightening my crumpled jacket, I walked about 10 minutes from the station to my company's entrance. Heading to the corner room on the second floor as instructed, an employee came and explained what I'd be doing that day. Since it was my first day, I spent the morning watching training videos and the afternoon greeting my department and receiving brief job instructions. Nice to meet you all. I'm Mike Johnson. Looking forward to working with you. I greeted everyone energetically. At my new workplace, everyone seemed nice, which was a relief. I had a reasonably good start and ended my first day as a company employee on a happy note. The company I joined, ENR Corporation, specializes in managing and maintaining office buildings. The company was founded by Mr. John Anderson and had about 50 employees. His wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson, was working as both the secretary and in charge of accounting. Everyone at the company unanimously said, "Our company has good interpersonal relationships." This was my first time working as an office worker, though I had many part-time jobs in the past where the workplace environment was tense due to human relations. However, this company had a family-like atmosphere where everyone worked lively. Even with my limited experience, I understood that such an environment is rare and fortunate. The company that hired me, a high school graduate, was a godsend. I wanted to cherish this opportunity. At ENR Corporation, I enjoyed a fulfilling company life. I accompanied seniors on business deals to learn about sales talk and even tried my hand at developing new business contacts. Every day was fresh and exciting. My previous part-time experiences involved mostly physical labor, like moving goods and sorting in warehouses, so using my brain more was tiring. But these were skills I wanted to learn, and I was happy to have the opportunity. About 3 months after joining, one day after finishing work and returning home, I stretched my arms towards the ceiling and told my wife, Sophia, "I'm tired, but it was a fulfilling day. Sophia then asked me, tired, huh? Do you enjoy your work? I replied, yeah, there's still a lot I'm not used to, but it's all a learning process, and I find it rewarding. Right, that's good, Sophia replied, but her expression seemed somewhat lacking in energy. What's wrong, Sophia? I asked. Then, with slight hesitation, Sophia said, well, it's just, she seemed to have something on her mind but was holding back, so I encouraged her. I want you to tell me whatever you're thinking. Actually, it seems like my brother has no intention of coming back. Dad is really getting angry about it, Sophia said. Sophia has an older brother who's 4 years her senior. He was supposedly going to take over their father's company, Wilson Real Estate, but that seemed like a vague plan. Mr. Wilson, her father, believed that his son would take over, but her brother Steve seemed uncertain and had not returned since going abroad for study. Originally, after graduating from college, he helped at his father's company. But during his second year of work, he said he was going for a short-term language study in Germany. The plan was for half a year, but he didn't come back even after 1 year, then 2. Communication was barely maintained through email with slow replies, causing worry for the family. Just yesterday, Sophia continued, Dad told my brother, enough is enough. Come back to the U.S. What about the company's succession? But my brother replied, I'm not coming back yet, and that really angered Dad. I could picture Mr. Wilson's angry, grief-stricken face in my mind. Normally, he's a gentle person, but I could sympathize with his frustration. If his only son, who he wanted to take over the company, was being evasive, at the same time, I could empathize with his son's desire to live overseas rather than spending his life working at an American company. Isn't it natural to want to live a life without regrets? As I listened to Sophia's story, sipping on a cold beer from the fridge, her next words took me by surprise, and I almost spat out my drink. So Dad is saying he wants you, Mike, to be his successor, she said. I blurted out in shock, what? I was just a high school graduate who had been wandering abroad as a backpacker. Sophia's brother was a capable elite, a graduate from a prestigious university. He was a far more suitable candidate than me. I was just fortunate to marry Sophia. I wasn't competent enough to take over her father's significant company. It was beyond being flattered. No, that's not happening, I told Sophia. Then Sophia said, that's a terrible way to put it. Do you dislike my father's company that much? Forget it. She looked sad and then locked herself in her room. That's not what I meant at all. It was our first fight. I rushed to her room to explain and clear up the misunderstanding. I didn't dislike Mr. Wilson's company, nor was I disinterested. In fact, being offered the chance to lead such a prestigious company was an opportunity and a blessing. But the feeling that I'm not up for it was strong, and just because Mr. Wilson was upset with his son, it didn't feel right to me to step in. After explaining this to Sophia, she understood, and we made up. 1.5 years had passed since I joined D&R Corporation. I had become quite accustomed to the job, securing new contracts and closing major deals. A senior who trained me as a new employee said, Mr. Wilson himself praised your remarkable growth, which made me really happy. I seemed to be well suited for this job, and my daily efforts were paying off. One day, I had an external meeting in the morning and in the afternoon. After returning to the office, I was checking my emails when my manager came and said, Mr. Wilson is calling you. Please come to his office. To the CEO's office. I was surprised since I had never been called to Mr. Anderson's office since joining the company. I had heard of department heads being summoned, but it was almost unheard of for an employee like me, only 1.5 years into the company, to be called by the CEO. Logging out of my computer, I nervously headed to Mr. Anderson's office and timidly entered, saying, This is Johnson. May I come in? Ah, Johnson, come in, I heard Mr. Anderson's voice. As I opened the door and entered, I saw Mr. Anderson sitting at the back with a woman beside him. It was his wife, Mrs. Mary Anderson. Both of them looked at me, making me freeze up in nervousness. Then Mrs. Anderson said kindly, Sorry for calling you in so suddenly. Did we interrupt your work? I hastily replied, No, it's all fine. I had only spoken to Mr. Anderson during my initial greeting upon joining the company, and this was my first time speaking with Mrs. Anderson, Though I had seen her around, I wondered what they could possibly want to discuss with me. Nervous they might say something bad, I quickly reassured myself with my usual positivity. It's okay, it's okay. About the matter, Mrs. Anderson continued. Mr. Anderson remained silent, making me even more nervous. Johnson, what's your father's name? She asked me. My father's name? I was taken aback. It's not common to be asked about your father's name at the workplace, especially not in the CEO's office. Is there something about my father? I asked hastily. Mr. Anderson, who had been quiet, began to laugh. Mary, you're not asking it right. Look how surprised Johnson is. Embarrassed, Mrs. Anderson slightly looked down and said, Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Your first name is Mike, right? Yes, my first name is Mike, and my father's name is George, I answered. Then Mrs. Anderson exclaimed, Oh, I knew it. I was completely baffled, not understanding what she meant by, I knew it. Is your surname truly Johnson? Did your surname change at some point? Oh, but it's too personal, you don't have to answer. I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson said gently. I hesitated for a moment. I'm sorry. As you said, my surname has changed. When I joined the company, it wasn't specifically asked, so I didn't mention having gotten married and taken my wife's last name. Until marriage, my last name was Baker. I responded honestly. When I married Sophia, her father, Mr. Wilson, had planned for his son Steve to take over the company, but he also wanted me to work there, suggesting I should take the Wilson name as part of the family. Changing my surname to Wilson wasn't an issue for me, so I accepted their suggestion. However, I kept my background secret upon joining MR Corporation because I was known as a relative of Wilson Real Estate, which operates in a similar industry. I didn't intend to lie when asked, so I thought it was best to be open about it for the sake of trust. But Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Anderson didn't call me to press about my connection to Wilson Real Estate. They had a different reason, which became clear later in the conversation. Ah, I knew it. I listened to Mrs. Anderson's second, I knew it, which she said in a voice even higher than before. Yes, indeed, you're the one from that time, Mrs. Anderson said. Mr. Anderson added, Yes, just as you thought from that time. I was still completely clueless. Excuse me, I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean by that time? I asked them, even though it might have been rude. Then Mrs. Anderson began her story. It was 22 years ago. I was pregnant with a child John's and mine. I still had 3 months to go until my due date and was out shopping alone. Suddenly, I was struck with severe abdominal pain and couldn't stand, so I sat down right there. Back then, not everyone carried a mobile phone like today, and I didn't have one. A woman passing by noticed something was wrong with me and approached me. Mr. Anderson was listening quietly, his gaze on the floor. She offered to call an ambulance, but I thought it was too much and asked for a taxi to go to the hospital. So she went to the road to hail a taxi. However, we couldn't catch one easily, and my abdominal pain worsened. While listening to Mrs. Anderson, I wondered anxiously if her baby was safe. She continued, Then a car stopped. The man driving asked what was wrong, and the woman helping me explained that I was pregnant and in pain. He offered to take me to the hospital in his car. I was hesitant to get into a stranger's car, but I was in too much pain to refuse, so I accepted the ride. Hearing up to this point, I couldn't help but blurt out, I'm glad. Mrs. Anderson continued, That man drove me to my usual maternity clinic. I was so grateful that I wanted to thank him later. So when I got out of the car, I asked for his name and contact details. However, he said no need for thanks and didn't give his contact. At least he wrote down his name on a piece of paper for me while I was struggling with the pain. It was George Baker. I was surprised my father, George Baker, had such a connection with Mrs. Anderson. The world is indeed a small place. Mrs. Anderson's story continued. Actually, in the car, Mr. Baker mentioned he was also on his way to a maternity clinic. It was different from the one I was going to, so he kindly dropped me off first. The reason he was going to another maternity clinic was, I interrupted her. Could it be? She said, Yes, it was for your birth. Your mother had gone into labor, so he was on his way there. I told him he should have left me and made sure to be there for his child's birth first. I would have understood, but he said, I can't just leave someone in trouble. It's fine. My son will wait for me. We decided to name him Mike. He's a smart boy. He'll wait. I felt terrible thinking if he missed his son's birth because of me. Finally, I began to understand. I told Mrs. Anderson, "Thank you. Even if my father hadn't made it to my birth, it would have been okay. Only my mother could give birth, so as long as he met me afterwards, it's fine." Hearing this, Mrs. Anderson looked disappointed and downcast. "So he didn't make it after all. I'm so sorry." I quickly said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to mislead you. Actually, my father was there for my birth. I don't remember it myself, but my father told me all about it, so there's no doubt about it." Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Anderson's expressions brightened, and they both exclaimed, "That's wonderful." Mrs. Anderson added, "We were always curious if Mr. Baker made it to the birth. We knew there was another child born in the neighborhood on the same day, so I thought maybe one day we'd meet little Mike at a playground or something, but we never did." Mrs. Anderson said this and looked sad. I said, "Mrs. Anderson, you gave birth on that day too, didn't you? That means you have a child the same age as me." I realized something was off. Mrs. Anderson tried to speak, then covered her face with a handkerchief, saying, "I'm sorry." Mr. Anderson spoke instead. "Our child was born but went to heaven. Whether it was because it was too early or the baby was too weak, or maybe both, nobody is to blame. Rather, it's thanks to your father, George Baker, who drove Mary to the hospital right away that our child lived for 3 months. The doctor said that if we had waited for a taxi, the baby might not have survived inside the womb. So we've always been grateful to Mr. Baker, hoping to meet him one day to express our thanks." I was speechless. I couldn't believe such a thing had happened. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know," asked insensitively. "I feel terrible for being so thoughtless. Was what my father did right? Was it not because he drove the car that happened?" I apologized. Mrs. Anderson, crying, said, "No, I hesitated to call an ambulance, and even if I had, we would have had to wait either way. Getting a ride from Mr. Baker was the best thing. The doctor also said so. It's thanks to him that our child could be born, even if only for a short while. We're grateful for that." Tears started flowing from my eyes too. I asked, "May I know your child's name?" "Michael," she said. "We hadn't decided on a name yet since it was still early, but hearing your father named his son Mike, we thought it was a beautiful name. My husband liked it, so we went with Michael, Mike for short." Mary said, "Michael, it's like he's my twin brother." I wiped my tears and said, "So that's right." Mr. Anderson said, "We've always thought of you, whom we never met, as our own son. We hoped he'd live well for Michael's sake. It must be strange to hear us say this." But Mr. Anderson explained, "We never thought you'd join our company. We didn't realize you were the same person because your last name was Wilson. But when your age matched perfectly, and your first name was Mike, we asked Mary to observe you discreetly. She wasn't sure but thought you resembled Mr. Baker, so we decided to ask you. And you were him, which makes us really happy. Thank you. I'm also glad to know this." I felt a mix of happiness and the Andersons' sorrow of losing their child. "Could we meet your father, Mr. Baker, to thank him? If it's difficult, maybe we could send a gift." "What would he like?" Mrs. Anderson asked. "Thank you for your kindness. Actually, my father has already passed away," I informed her. "Oh, I'm so sorry for speaking thoughtlessly. What about your mother?" Mrs. Anderson said apologetically. "Don't worry about it. My mother passed away before him when I was 2, from a heart condition. I don't have many memories of her. My father raised me alone. He died of cancer 3 years ago." I told them. "Oh, I had no idea," Mrs. Anderson said, tears streaming down her face. She reached out to hug me but suddenly pulled back, exclaiming, "No, I'm sorry. I've always thought of you, Mike, whom I knew only by name, with a mother's affection. I impulsively wanted to embrace you like a son when I heard about your misfortune. How embarrassing. I'm really sorry." Hearing this, I responded, "No, I'm grateful that you think of me that way. I'm an adult now but still in my early 20s, and it's lonely without both my parents sometimes. I get melancholic." Mr. Anderson immediately said, "You're not just an employee to us, but like a son. Feel free to rely on us anytime you're in trouble." "Thank you," I said, tears welling up again. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson were also crying. After that incident, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson began to care for me even more. Years passed, and thanks to my hard work, I quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a department head. Mr. Anderson even mentioned, "I'd be happy if you could someday be a director of our company." It was still hard to imagine, but I could feel they genuinely thought of me as their son. Moreover, I had another set of parental figures, my wife Sophia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Essentially, they were my in-laws. They too treated me like their own son and were always kind to me. Mr. Wilson kept saying, "Our company will be inherited by Mike," which made me feel grateful yet burdened with a heavy responsibility. To be trusted and spoken of in such a way by both the CEO of my wife's father's company and the CEO of the company I currently work for is a testament to their confidence in me, which I find both gratifying and humbling. Sometimes, I even wish there were two of me to meet both CEOs' expectations. However, there's been recent progress concerning the succession of Mr. Wilson's company. Sophia's brother Steve has finally decided to return and take over as co-CEO. Mr. Wilson said, "Steve coming back now, there's no place for him," but I believe that's not what he truly feels. Deep down, he's probably delighted that his son is ready to take over the company. I can tell from Mr. Wilson's words and actions, and I hope for the strong bond of parent and child to prevail. That's why I feel that Wilson Real Estate should be left to Steve to handle. Meanwhile, Sophia and I are expecting a child. Our initial encounter when Sophia helped me during a severe bout of abdominal pain in Thailand, and the connection Mrs. Anderson had with my father when she was pregnant, all these bonds have intertwined to shape who I am today. Michael, who was just a baby, and my own parents who are now in heaven, make me realize that the birth of our new child isn't just our happiness but also a reminder to share gratitude and joy with many. If it's a boy, we could use the letter M in his name like Mark. But what about if it's a girl? As I pondered this, Sophia suggested, "How about Mary?" I replied, "That's a wonderful idea," and we both smiled, happy with the thought.
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my 2nd year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. "I will do my best." Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. "Did you not hear what I said?" "I'm sorry." I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, "I'm thirsty." Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. "I don't care what they say, I plan to quit anytime," he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. "To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance." As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. "Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them." It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. Still here? Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick? What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I obediently followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was. As the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here." "He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.